Today I'm going to do a World War II talk about the Japanese aircraft that were rebuilt at Hangar 7 in Brisbane during World War II. I'll just share my PowerPoint screen now. And I'll run that. Okay, so what you can see here is a real A6M3 Mitsubishi Type 32 Zeke Type 32 flying over Brisbane during World War II. If you look closely, you can see Redcliffe in the distance and the Hornibrook Bridge across to Redcliffe, and Sandgate racetrack, down here in the lagoon. So that's and that's Beams Road just there, running along there. So I've got quite a few slides, so I shall move on. So after Pearl Harbor, the American and Australian military realised they knew little about Japanese aircraft and their capabilities, and Allied pilots had very few aids to help them identify Japanese aircraft. Initially they relied on Japanese magazines, aviation magazines, and Jane's All the World's Aircraft, which had only sketchy information on Japanese aircraft. After General Douglas MacArthur escaped from the Philippines in March 1942 and arrived in Melbourne, he authorised the Directorate of Intelligence, Allied Air Forces, located at that time in Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, to take complete charge of all enemy crashed or captured aircraft or personnel in the Southwest Pacific area, which was his theatre of command. Captain Frank T. McCoy Jr. became the Materiel Officer, and it's spelt M-A-T-E-R-I-E-L, in charge of the new Materiel section. It was initially located at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, and their role was to evaluate captured Japanese equipment. Technical Sergeant Francis, or Fran was his nickname, F-R-A-N, M. Williams, and Corporal Joseph, or Joe, Grattan were the other two members of the Materiel section at that time. Identifying and describing Japanese aircraft became a real problem for the Allies at the start of the war. Initially, pilots referred to all Japanese fighter aircraft as Zeros, and bombers tended to be called Mitsubishis or Nakajimas. Fran Williams suggested to Captain Frank McCoy that they should assign code names for the confusing variety of Japanese aircraft, many of which had hard to pronounce aircraft names. McCoy, Williams and Grattan went on to develop a set of code names based on common English names in about July 1942. Fighter aircraft used male names, bombers used female names, etc., etc. This list of codes was published in September 1942 and was called at that time the Intelligence Information Memorandum No. 12, Japanese Air Services and Japanese Aircraft. McCoy's group went on to become responsible for producing code names and associated silhouettes. The system was also known as the MacArthur Southwest Pacific Code Name System. Later on it was called the Allied Code Name System when it was adopted in other theatres of war. With McCoy being from Tennessee, a number of the early code names were of a hillbilly nature or origin. For example, Zeke, Roof, Nate and Pete. McCoy, Williams and Grattan even gave their own Christian names to Japanese aircraft. So there was a Frank, a Francis and a Joe. The Japanese aircraft named Louise was named after Frank McCoy's wife, Louise, and the June was named after Frank's daughter, and Ida after Joe Grattan's girlfriend in the USA. The Mitsubishi GM41 Betty bomber was named after an attractive, well-endowed American nurse. Apparently, the rather pronounced gun blisters on the aircraft reminded them of an American nurse called Betty, probably one of their girlfriends. Some Japanese aircraft were given code names from RAAF personnel serving in the materiel section. For example, Flight Sergeant George Remington, RAAF, was their technical illustrator. He produced silhouette drawings for aircraft recognition. His first name, George, was used to identify the Kawanishi N1KJ Navy interceptor fighter. Squadron Leader Norm Clapperson, RAAF, a former commissioner of Rabaul, recruited, trained and led aircraft recovery teams in the field. He spent a lot of time in New Guinea and the islands. His name Norm was used for the Kawanishi E-15K1 reconnaissance seaplane. The materiel section moved to Brisbane in about mid-1942, probably around July, at the same time that General Douglas MacArthur and his General Headquarters Southwest Pacific Area relocated to Brisbane. Captain Frank T. McCoy of the Materiel Section, G2 Section of the 5th Air Force Headquarters, had his office in room 208 in the AMP building, so in the second floor of this building. In about March 1943, McCoy's Materiel Section in Brisbane became known as the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit. It was a joint US Army Air Force, US Navy and RAAF unit. And going through some of the records, I even spotted at least one Royal Air Force person attached to the unit from the UK. On the 9th of October 1942, Lieutenant Clyde Gessel was assigned as the Enemy Equipment Engineer in Air Service Command of the 5th Air Force. Lieutenant Gessel was placed in charge of the newly erected Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane, located at the eastern end of the line of hangars and at right angles to the others, presumably to offer some level of secrecy for the activities that were happening inside that hangar. So you can see Hangar 7 there. It still stands today and is now heritage listed. McCoy's men were given a document known as a MacArthur Pass. This was signed by General Douglas MacArthur. Here you can see a copy of Clyde Gessel's MacArthur Pass. This allowed Clyde to go wherever he needed and to commandeer whatever resources were required to achieve his mission. And here is another MacArthur Pass, this time for an RAAF member, Flying Officer Noel F. Miller, M-I-L-L-A-R. Clyde Gessel lived for a short while at Tumu, it was only a few days in fact, at 86 Hillside Crescent at Hamilton, in a house previously occupied by General Rush B. Lincoln. I escorted Clyde's daughter Linda Grow and her husband Robert to see Tumu on the 6th of December 2010 during one of their visits to Australia. And we managed to run into the then owner of the house, who was very interested in the story that we shared with them. On 27th of December 1942, Australian infantry soldiers found what appeared to be a new type of Japanese aircraft at Boona Airfield. The Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in Brisbane was immediately notified. They arranged for the aircraft to be secured and had small fittings and instruments salvaged before the souvenir hunters arrived on site. 7 enlisted men from a US service squadron under the direction of an ATAIU technical inspector started to dismantle the aircraft. It was initially determined that at least 2 aircraft airframes plus all available engines and other small parts would be required to build one aircraft. It was thought to be a new design due to its square wingtips. It was initially given the code name HAP after US Army Air Force Chief of Staff General Henry Hap Arnold. This was quickly changed to HAMP in about November 1943, when the ATAIU was advised that General Hap Arnold was not at all impressed that his name had been used to identify an enemy aircraft. The unit eventually realised the aircraft was not a new design but a variation of the Zeke, or Zero. This modified Zeke had more horsepower, and the small folding wing tips had been removed and wingtip fairings fitted to achieve that squared-off wingtip appearance. Once it was realised it was not a new type of aircraft, its code name was changed from HAMP to Zeke 32. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kazuo Tsunoda, stationed at Buna Airfield, made a crash landing after his Zeke 32 was damaged by a USAAF P-39 Airacobra on the 26th of August 1942. In this photo you can see the Japanese markings on the fuselage. The top line there you can see translates to Navy donated aircraft, Hokuko number 872, which is the donation number, and then on the next line that translates to Korean for Bang Yui Seok, which was the name of the donor of that aircraft, a wealthy Korean business person. Here's a photo of a different wrecked Zeke 32 that they found there at Buna. Another shot of a wrecked aircraft being loaded onto a trailer behind a jeep, and a shot of them lifting an engine using a tripod onto a trailer. And here they are loading another part of a fuselage onto a barge, with one fuselage already on the barge, and you can see 4 engines, 3 of them covered at the back of the barge there. The wreckage of the Zeke 32s arrived in Brisbane on the ship SS Stephen Field on the 19th of February 1943. On about the 24th of February, work started with the rebuild of the first Japanese aircraft inside Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm Airfield. In this photo here you can see parts of other Japanese aircraft inside Hangar 7. On closer examination, there was more damage which became obvious due to the intensive aerial strafing, bombing and small arms fire and medium calibre ground fire that occurred in that area. Plus there was other damage inflicted by the fleeing Japanese and souvenir hunters, both Japanese and Allied. Clyde Gessell commented in his diary on Anzac Day 1943, "The reconstruction on the plane has been progressing slowly. Too many bullet holes in the plane." Here you can see a pile of captured Japanese engines and other airframe parts near Hangar 7. If you look closer you can see some civilians in the background. It looks like a couple of ladies standing at the Eagle Farm railway station, which was immediately behind Hangar 7. It's no longer in use today. In this photo of the office area, which is located inside Hangar 7, you can see the sloped roof there. You can see 2 civilian ladies that were employed inside Hangar 7. And I believe that's Sergeant Fran Williams at the far right with his hand on his chin. Once the reconstruction of the Zero was complete, it was painted in its original Japanese colour scheme, complete with the red Japanese Hinamaru, the red meatball as it was affectionately known. This was to facilitate aerial photos to be taken for aircraft recognition booklets. An Allied aircraft accompanied the Zero on the flight to protect it from being shot down by any keen Allied pilots not aware of the ATAIU's role in testing Japanese aircraft. It was then repainted in American markings to lessen that possibility. Here you can see a nice photo of Clyde Gessell, fourth from the left with his men standing in front of the Zero, and another shot with Clyde at the far left with a few of his men in front of the Zeke 32. Another nice shot of the Zeke at Eagle Farm Airfield. It almost looks like an Airfix model in this photo. Looks like a tiny little thing. And this is the classic photo of the Zeke 32 parked outside the eastern end of hangar number 7. Another shot of the Zero flying over Brisbane with Eagle Farm Airfield at the left, and Albion Park racetrack. You can just see it centre right near the bend in the river there. Captain Bill Farrier became the first American pilot to fly the rebuilt Zeke 32 at Eagle Farm for 30 minutes on the 20th of July 1943. Farrier became commanding officer of the 81st Depot Repair Squadron in October 1943. It was one of the units attached to the 81st Air Depot Group at Depot Number 1, as it was known at Eagle Farm Airfield. Farrier was chosen to fly the Zeke due to his short stature. Here's some records that Bill Farrier kept of his various flights. He flew numerous Japanese aircraft during World War II. Those in the red box are the flights in the Zeke 32 at Eagle Farm Airfield. The other flights were back in the USA, where he flew Zeke 52s, Oscars, Tonys, Dinas, Kates and a Nick. Bill Farrier's son Owen, who lives in Hawaii, was in Brisbane for the opening of the new Heritage Centre at Eagle Farm in July 2015. I'll talk about the Heritage Centre a bit later. Captain Paul C. May of the 81st Depot Repair Squadron of the 81st Air Depot Group was the pilot originally selected to fly the Zero before Bill Farrier got the job. However, Captain May refused to fly the Zero as he was concerned about its brakes, which he believed were faulty. Captain Paul C. May was unfortunately killed in an A-20 Havoc crash near Amberley Airfield on the 17th of July 1943, a few days before the first Zero flight. I'm sure many of you would have heard of Gabby Kennard OAM, who was the first Australian woman to fly solo around the world in 1989 in a single-engined aircraft. Her father was an American test pilot, Lieutenant James J. Handley. He was killed in this same aircraft crash. Gabby's mother worked for the 81st Air Depot Group at Eagle Farm Airfield during World War II. Bill Farrier was able to put together a cockpit checklist for the Zero with the assistance of a Japanese pilot who was a POW in Brisbane, held out at Enoggera. Japanese prisoners were generally very cooperative. Rather than being interrogations, the sessions with Japanese POWs tended to be Q&A sessions. The Japanese military command had not instructed their personnel to withhold sensitive information from the enemy once they were captured. Farrier made a second flight in the Zero on the 21st of July 1943. He made an emergency landing at Eagle Farm Airfield after an engine cutout during a slow roll due to carburetor problems. The right side landing gear was badly damaged due to a heavy landing and a subsequent ground loop, which was probably caused by a grabbing brake. So perhaps Captain Paul May was right about the suspect brakes in the Zero. Since the start of test flights, some US instruments were fitted, including an altimeter, a rate of climb meter, an airspeed indicator and a free air temperature gauge. Captain Farrier made a third flight in the Zero over Brisbane on the 27th of July 1943. Clyde Gessel wrote in his journal on the 10th of August 1943, "We have flown the Japanese airplane, 6 flights. Quite a feat after putting together a mass of shot-up junk." Mock dogfights between the Zero and a Mark V Spitfire were carried out at Eagle Farm Airfield on the 14th, 17th and 18th of August 1943. Flight Lieutenant Clive Warren piloted the Spitfire and Squadron Leader Les Jackson piloted the Zero. They found the Zero was superior to the Spitfire below 20,000 feet, and the Spitfire needed to stay above 250 miles an hour to maintain an advantage over the Zero. On the 8th of September 1943, the Zero flew down to Laverton Airfield in Victoria, about a 4.5-hour flight, for about 10 days of engine testing and other technical flight tests. Squadron Leader Derek Randall, or Gel was his nickname, Cumming, of the RAAF Special Duties and Performance Flight, performed altitude, speed, diving and climb tests in the Zero. The Zero returned to Brisbane on the 24th of September 1943. A copy of the report shown here on this slide can be found in the National Archives of Australia. So here's a photo of the Zero flying over the Laverton area in August 1943. 3 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars were used to rebuild a single flyable Oscar in Hangar 7. Its tail number was XJ002, signifying that it was the second Japanese aircraft rebuilt at Hangar 7. The XJ was apparently to identify the aircraft as an experimental Japanese aircraft. Parts of a Sonia, Betty and a Dina were also brought back to Hangar 7. And here's a photo of the Sonia that was brought back to the hangar. It's a photo showing the men working on the Oscar inside Hangar 7, and another similar photo of men working on the Oscar inside Hangar 7. And here is the Oscar almost ready for an engine test run at Eagle Farm, just outside Hangar 7. And here it is during an engine test run. And you can see 2 guys there with fire extinguishers at the ready, just in case they had a fire. Captain Bill Farrier test flew the Oscar on the 17th and the 18th of March 1944. It's another photo of the Oscar at Eagle Farm. Squadron Leader Derek Cumming of the RAAF Special Duties and Performance Flight, here in the Oscar preparing for a test flight. I don't know whether that was at Laverton or at Eagle Farm, possibly Laverton. The Oscar here flying over Brisbane, and you can see Camp Doomben below the aircraft, Camp Ascot at the left, and the US Army's large Headley Park storage area at the top right. Another nice photo of the Hangar 7 Oscar. Note it's got the XJ002 on the tail and the stars and bars. So that's later in the war. A Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, construction number 263, was captured by the Americans, should I say, on Tullavu, New Britain, on the 2nd of January 1944 during Operation Cartwheel. It was secured and transported to Hangar 7 in mid-January 1944. When first sighted in combat on the 20th of August 1943, it was thought to be a Japanese copy of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Then later on it was believed it was a Japanese-built Macchi C-202 or a C-205. So it was given the code name of Tony being short for the Italian name Antonio. Here you can see the dark green ripple camouflage scheme marking of the 68th Sentai, with the Sentai leaders band behind the cockpit. By September 1943, when the first Tony wrecks were inspected, it was realised it was not of Italian design. The code name Tony, however, was still retained. The Tony arrived at Hangar 7 in February 1944, and its control surfaces were recovered, the undercarriage inspected and serviced, and the electrical systems were inspected. An American 24-volt battery and transformer were installed in the fuselage ammo bay after removal of the ammunition bins. The remaining armament was serviced and retained. And this is a very nice photo of the rebuilt Tony flying over Brisbane, painted with the American stars and bars on the wings and fuselage, and you can see the XJ003 painted on the tail. So that was on the 4th of July 1944. RAAF pilot Ron McDonald test flew P-40N Kitty Hawk A29803 and Spitfire A58-424 against the Japanese Tony between the 29th of September and the 7th of October 1944. Squadron leader Ken James apparently also flew the Spitfire against the Tony. The Tony used the Kawasaki HA40 inverted V12 liquid-cooled inline engine. It was a license-built copy of a Daimler-Benz DB601A from the German Messerschmitt 109. This engine was very troublesome for the Japanese and also for the ATAIU. It had an ineffective radiator and a complicated cooling system. Frank McCoy told historian Bob Piper, the late Bob Piper, many years after the war, the reason why the Tony engines were failing. The Japanese had apparently swung the camshaft in the opposite direction, but they made one mistake. They left the oil holes on the camshaft in the same place. So when the camshaft spun, it was throwing the oil in the wrong direction. This is a photo of the nose art on Frank McCoy's personal C-47. It's a little bit hard to see, but it shows a souvenir scrounger pulling an aircraft apart, a Japanese aircraft apart. Scrounging was a real issue that constantly upset the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit personnel. Here's a photo of men of the 43rd Engineers, US Army, beside a Japanese aircraft which had been stripped of its metal in many places by scroungers. The ATAIU had a saying regarding scroungers. The Germans fought for Hitler, the Japanese fought for their emperor, and the Americans fought for souvenirs. The unit used photo ID boards and photographed the Japanese aircraft, showing the location and aircraft serial number on the boards. You can see a photo here of one in Alandia. It's a Lily. It's another photo of a KI-54 Hickory. And you can see the photo ID board. You'll see in this photo that they used measuring tape, which they applied to the aircraft before taking their photos. Each colour change in the tape is 1 inch long, and you can see the tape even runs right up the aerial on this particular Tony aircraft. The unit maximised intelligence information obtained from captured Japanese aircraft. That's what the whole purpose of the unit was, to gain intelligence. They produced identification profiles for aircraft recognition booklets, including various camouflage and identification markings. They determined performance capability and fighter tactics for Allied pilots. They evaluated construction techniques, including any innovation and weak spots that Allied aircraft could target during dogfights. They evaluated armament capability, and they harvested target information for bombing raids using the nameplate details on recovered nameplates. This was a practice known as jam tinning. The unit discovered a number of weight-saving techniques adopted by the Japanese. The Zeke 32 and the Oscar used a single-piece wing rather than two wings attached at a heavy wing root plate. Their wings had holes drilled in the ribs, and the fuselage had holes drilled in formers to lighten the aircraft. A telling statistic was that US fighters were almost 50% heavier than Japanese aircraft of the same size, which is quite significant. I'll repeat that. US fighters were almost 50% heavier than Japanese aircraft of the same size. In January 1943, Clyde Gassel submitted a sample of Japanese aircraft tyres to the Goodyear Company to help them design better tyres for the US military. On the 4th of January 43, Gessel and Sergeant Maybeal travelled by jeep to Amberley Airfield for some live firing testing on some Japanese armour plate. And Clyde went on to comment in his diary, "After seeing what our bullets did to the armour plate on airplanes, I believe the Japs just used it for psychological purposes." Jam tins, or nameplates, were sent by the unit to AIRIND, AIRIND, which was a sister group in Brisbane whose role was to target Japanese aircraft industry for bombing raids. AIRIND used intelligence from the jam tins for determining target information from factory names and towns that appeared on the jam tins, and production rates and any impact on production rates following bombing raids from the month and year that was found on the jam tins. Wing Commander Norman Barnett Tyndale, an anthropologist from Adelaide, headed AIRIND, the AIRIND group, which included US Army Air Force personnel and a further 4 RAAF personnel. Tyndale's group moved to the Pentagon in Washington DC from Brisbane in June 1944, where they spent the rest of the war. Their work was critical to the strategic bombing offensive mounted against the Japanese aircraft industry targets. After the Doolittle raid on Tokyo on the 18th of April 1942, jam tins were collected from items produced by an accessory manufacturing plant that had been targeted. The jam tin data showed a gap in the dates of manufacture, but not a corresponding gap in serial numbers. The length of time the plant was out of production was therefore able to be readily determined from the jam tin information, thus giving an assessment of the impact of the raid, of the Doolittle raid. I just thought I'd throw this slide in just to, as this is a talk for Air Force history and heritage, showing you a number of the RAAF personnel that I've located in records that served with the ATAIU. This was a list put together in late 1944. Hangar 7 is a nailed hardwood timber arch construction igloo with a ribbed metal sheet cladding roof. The hangar type was designed by Frenchman Emile Brisset, who escaped out of Singapore in February 1942. Brisset designed the hangars so that they could be erected quickly at very low cost. His concept was that if the hangar lasted more than 2 years, he had over-designed the hangar. Hangar 7 still there, well over 70 years later. Access to Hangar 7 today is via Lamington Avenue, which was the original road to the old Brisbane airport. Bob Tucker, at the right in the top left photo, the Managing Director of Trade Coast Central, is seen showing Linda and Robert Grove a street that he has named after Linda's father, Clyde Gessel. He also named another street after the test pilot, William Farrier. The Australian Governor-General, Sir Peter Cosgrove, opened the new Trade Coast Central Heritage Park Interpretive Centre on the 17th of July 2015. The centre is located upstairs through this door just here. There is an Allison engine located just inside the door on the right, and if you look at the photo you can see there's a viewing platform at the far right. And here we have got a shot inside the Heritage Centre of Bob Tucker showing a group from the Bernie Bray Community Centre around his Heritage Centre. There are self-guided audio walking trails with interpretive signs, some with audio buttons, and free Wi-Fi. The walkways connect the Heritage Centre with the 3 heritage sites: Hangar 7, the Ellison engine test stands, and the women's convict prison and factory that was located under the park you can see in the photo. These are some of the displays for the women's convict prison and factory that was underneath this park. By the way, that land there has been raised by about 1.5 metres. There's a shot of the Ellison engine test stands, which are located a short distance to the east of the Heritage Centre. There are a couple of eating places on site, including the Hangar 7 Cafe and a Subway shop. There is an elevated viewing platform at the Heritage Centre from which you can view the 3 heritage sites. And here's one of the display boards for Hangar 7, and with Hangar 7 in the background there. I'm about to show you about 7 minutes of 19-minute footage, which is very rare footage, of the Mitsubishi A6M3 Zeke, which was rebuilt in Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm Airfield and flown around Brisbane on a number of occasions. The film was a silent film when I got it, and I recently added some sound effects and background music. I just need to stop this PowerPoint now and I'll share a new screen once I work out how to do that. Thanks.